Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Fronteras, A Changing America. I'm Johnny Coker. According to the U.S. Drought Monitor, over 30% of New Mexico's land area is experiencing extreme levels of drought, much of that manifesting in the borderland region. But what does it all mean for us here in southern New Mexico? Joining us to talk about this and more is Dr. David DuBois, state climatologist and director of the New Mexico Climate Center. Thanks so much for being here today.
It's good to be here.
Of course, so you're a man of many titles, but can you just give me a rundown of your responsibilities as New Mexico's state climatologist? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, like you said, it's put on many hats. So I am a faculty member in New Mexico State University. I'm in the Plant and Environmental Science Department. It's one of my hats, and then my state climatologist hat is basically mandated by the state statutes. So I have a list of things I, mandated to do, and a lot of it's directing climate programs, education, helping out the state's decision making using climate information, climate data, and also running a statewide weather station network called ZIAMET.
And I wanted to ask a little bit about the climate literacy and some of the work you do amongst the general public and as well with policy makers. I mean, how do you approach communicating this type of science, especially as it gets complex, to the public and policymakers, especially as it relates to issues like fire risk and drought that we're experiencing here in New Mexico?
Yeah, it's a really good question. What I usually do is I work with state agencies. So like most recently, the Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resource, EMNRD. And so we've been working with them on a climate adaptation plan for the state. Basically what that does is, knowing that the future holds different climate, so how do we adapt to it? How do we become more resilient to, say, hotter temperatures, heat waves, more erratic snowfall, rainfall, drought, things like that. And so, providing that, how do we use the past information to look at the future? We can't usually, these days, we can't usually use the past to predict the future anymore. We have to have models, and so what I try to do is like simplify things and make it more applicable, and use that to help plan for instance, like water management. Like the 50 water year plan for the Interstate Stream Commission is one example of that. It's a big team effort to look at. So what are how do we become more resilient to droughts and things like that it's involve community members as well as the managing government. Yeah.
And what are the main avenues of tracking this type of data? How do you gather the data in order to inform policy making decisions or to inform the general public about what's going on? What type of models do you use?
Yeah, so we as state climatologists across the country, which most all states have one, we're sort of like guardians, or we're more brokers. Like a better word for to describe it is getting data from different resources: state, federal, local, tribal, community, municipal, wherever we can to help kind of frame the environment. So a lot of it's data that we collect. So like stream flow, even traffic counts is part of it. Rainfall, but we also use models, and so a lot of our modeling is from federal agencies, so like USGS or NOAA, NASA. So we tap into those, and then we try to provide that information out of all the terabytes and terabytes of data, try to find what's the most relevant data set for this particular problem, and then try to help maybe I wouldn't say solve it, but maybe help guide it in terms of, so what are we looking for as the intended results? So do we want to know how to design a better culvert or a bigger culvert, or is it smaller? How do we design our system? So we have to use past data as well as future data to kind of guide that.
I see. And so how does, from what you can tell and from what data is out there, how does the current situation in New Mexico, the current drought that we're seeing through the state and the extreme drought conditions, how does that compare to, other historic droughts that the state has seen? What type of modeling do we have there, or reference points do we have there?
Yeah. So we've been in drought for about 25 years now. And it's been labeled a mega drought because those are usually defined as more than 20 years. So we've got some good information just in that 25-year period. So not only the science, the measurements, the temperatures, the evaporation and surface water and things like that, groundwater even, but we also have the social science data as well. So how do we respond to it? So how do people manage, how do ranchers adapt to not having enough water for forage and things like that? So it's both the physical system and the human systems, and there's also ecological as well. So we kind of, the most relevant is the most recent because we can easily use and tap into it, interview people, but we can also dip into the paleo records. So like tree rings, things like that. They can take us back several hundred years or even 1,000 years in the past and say, well, how did we adapt? And looking at, say, Anasazi, the cultures, when they were there in the 1500s or 1300s, what was it like? Because we can go back and look at the tree rings and estimate what the precipitation was and migration, things like that. So we can dip into those data sets depending on where we are, and then kind of put into a bigger context. But using the most recent as probably our more relevant sources of information.
Right, more relevant and accurate, I assume, because of the tools that have been developed,
exactly,
right? Yeah. And so from what you can tell, how severe, like I said earlier, how severe is this drought that we're experiencing historically from your understanding?
Yeah, so we just from we tend to dip from our lifetimes, maybe even our parents or grandparents, looking at the 30s, the Dust Bowl, and then another one is the 50s droughts, and then looking at the current drought. So how do we compare those, and what did your grandparents do back then, or your parents do, and then what are you doing now, depending on your kind of job, what do you do, and so how to put them in context. And one of the main things that differentiates the current droughts is they're warmer than the past droughts. The average temperature has increased. Even if you go back into the 50s, we're actually warmer than that drought. Even though there were some really dry years back then, our system is different.
And this is some of the data that I pulled from, according to the National Weather Service in 2023. This is from El Paso. El Paso experienced a record 70 days above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which the average since 1887 has been 16 days per year. So how significant is that, and is this sustainable? Like, how drastically are we going to have to change the way we live if we continue to see this model going the way that it is?
Yeah. So that's some of the big kind of decision-making questions that we're trying to tackle right now. We don't have all the answers. We've got some answers that are starting to kind of percolate up in terms of urban heat versus animals, vegetation, ecosystems. It's all kind of put together, and looking at like urban heat. We got the urban heat island, which kind of adds on top of the normal hot days, the heat waves, and then you got to think about our people, us, our social networks, our people, our the different age groups, and so how do they adapt? How can we protect them? Kind of warning. That's what National Weather Service does is warn. Give several days advance notice of heat waves. And then it's a matter of us as members of society as to how do we use that information? Do we say, okay, that person's air condition is probably not up to speed for that temperature. Let's fight them over. Or the cities. A lot of cities are opening cooling centers. Places where it's a safe area to go hang out for the heat of the day, while they kind of play games, watch something, or have some kind of social get together. I don't know, but sort of how do we mix all that together, and and kind of plan out for the future. And every community is different, and so it may work in a big city, but how does it work in a smaller village when you have to be outside? Especially when you're working outside.
Right.
Outdoor workers. That's another big challenge.
And so, in your discussions with, when you talk to state leaders or policymakers, what are some recommendations, as the state climatologist, that New Mexico should really be looking at or working toward in terms of making the severity of these severe events not as devastating, I suppose?
Yeah. So just for example, we've been working with the New Mexico Environment Department, the Occupational Health, as well as the Department of Health, and looking at a heat standard. So what should we put into that kind of gives guidance on worker protection for those really hot days? And so, you're wearing personal protection, which gives you extra heat. You got all the stuff on, but you're also in a hot environment. So what are some things that we need to make people aware, employers?
Right.
And those are always a team effort. Folks who know the PPE type of wear, and then I provide more of the context of the temperatures, and it's not just temperatures, it's relative humidity, heat index, and there's a bunch of other things that we could throw in that provide, it's not, even at temperatures down to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, we start to see health effects, heat-related illnesses, people going to the ER, all the way down to 80 degrees. We didn't think of that in the past, but if you start looking at the data, the epidemiological data, we start seeing that. And that was surprising to me, is, I typically say, oh yeah, the mid-90s to 100, yeah, that's when you start to see people be affected. But no, it's actually lower than that. And so we have to kind of think about that a little more, and especially when you have numbers to back it up.
Right. And speaking of these extreme weather events, something I did want to ask you about is some of these severe dust storms that we've been seeing across our area over the last month or so, maybe 2 months. You've spoken to me in the past regarding the impact of dust storms on snowpack, creating a cycle of drought, essentially. Can you go into that a little bit for us here? Yeah.
So the one of the impacts that we've seen in terms of affecting the hydrologic and climate system is dust, especially on a regional scale. So if you think of like the Four Corners, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, that whole area. And so if we have really dry years, and specifically springtime dust storm, high winds, we usually get the winds, they're predominantly from the southwest. So they'll start over in Arizona, and then they'll pick up dust, and then they'll transport that dust into southwest Colorado, and then even into the San Juan Mountains. And somewhat similar in New Mexico, although southwest is more on the east side of Colorado. But so that when we get dust on snow, we call it dust on snow events, is we basically the nice white snow becomes darker because you're spreading dust on it. It becomes actually brown, literally brown, the dust on top of the snow. So you get the whole landscape, this whole mountain, to become brown. And I've seen pictures of it. And so what that does, if something is darker, it absorbs heat, just like a dark car is warmer than a light car. And so because of that, it absorbs the solar radiation and it starts to melt faster. So you can get, there's some groups have done modeling studies that the snowpack that has dust on it can melt out up to like a month earlier. And it's, it all depends on how many dust storms, how thick the dust storms, and intensity and things like that, and where the elevations and something. So it can actually impact our runoff into the Rio Grande Basin and San Juan Basin, and then affect how much water it can get into Elephant Butte. So it's all connected.
Wow. And I want to ask about the snowpack a little bit here in a minute, but I wanted to ask, what are the mechanisms that have led to this spring being such a bad year for these dust storms that we're seeing across our region. Is this something that we should expect to see more in the future as part of your climate modeling, or is this a freak event? What does that look like from your end?
Yeah, so we have to really look at the context, not just this spring, but go back maybe a year. So what happened? What was the environment? Did we get rainfall? What kind of vegetation grew? What time? And then kind of the evolution of that in terms of if it did rain at one certain point, did the soils, did it soak in? Was it real intense rain, or was it nice even rain, slow rain? And then where did it fall? So it's all those things, and then how dry has it been since that since the winter time. And so all that kind of is kind of a recipe. If you put all that in, you have dry, especially down in the southern part of the state.
Right.
We missed out on the monsoon, so it's been dry ever since. We've had some rain in the fall and winter, but not a lot. So it's been pretty dry throughout the entire last 12 months. And actually, we're one of the driest 12 months on record, and we're 6 inches below average for the last 12 months, which is a lot of rainfall, because we usually only get 9 inches, and we're below 6 inches. So given that information, we normally we typically get high winds in the spring. That's kind of our. We usually expect that. So
right.
This particular year, we actually got a little more winds. The average winds was a little more. It wasn't crazy wind, but it was above average. We've had some days with above 40 and 50 miles an hour. And so high winds, extreme drought, no soil moisture, and then especially over the entire area, you're going to get dust. So, looking at the years where we had drought, there's correlations of drought and dust. So we can kind of expect that. And then it all depends on the durations. How many dust storms, how many high wind events are we going to get? These storms come in. We've had a bunch.
Wow. Yeah. And, and it's a matter of all these factors coming to a head. So like I mentioned earlier, the snowpack, what does this mean for the snowpack on the San Juan Mountains and for the water being fed into the Rio Grande? How's that looking for this year, again, based on your modeling?
Yeah, so our water that we get down here from the Rio Grande is from snowpack in Colorado, mostly snowpack in Colorado, and then some from the Tusas and the Sangre de Cristos, Chama, the basin, and then eventually it goes down the river. We manage it, we store it in reservoirs, and then we release water when we need it for agricultural uses. So if our system, if the weather systems are basically don't deliver a lot of precipitation in Colorado, and the same holds for the Colorado basin, which has lots of drinking straws in Arizona, right? So if a lot of the storms miss out, or they go over us, but they don't produce any precipitation, they're dry systems, we're going to miss out on that. And we saw early in the water year, which starts in October, so October 24, we had some really good snowpack, but then it kind of shut off. It was, if you look at the trace of it was flat. It was like flat line. We had a few events, but it just wasn't enough snow, and we call that snow drought. We get pictures from our field, our colleagues in the USDA, NRCS, who do the snow measurements. You can see the ground. Normally there would be a meter of snow in the ground, but they're just walking on the soil.
Oh boy!
And so that's the kind of snow drought we're seeing up in the mountains. Not the very high elevations, but the lower 10,000 feet,
right,
around there, and that affects us.
Yeah, and that does affect us. And last year, obviously, New Mexico, especially here in the southern part of the state, we had some devastating wildfires in Ruidoso. What does this all mean for the Sacramento Mountains and the fire season in New Mexico as a whole? Obviously, things aren't looking good, but what's your assessment of that? Yeah, so we
knew what happens when we mix high winds, dry, fuel moisture. That's the word for stuff that can burn, and it looks, from the recipe of things, it looks similar, in terms of the risk from last year. All depends on what the monsoon will bring. but it doesn't look like much rainfall. I mean, we're done with snow. I mean, it's from the snow water equivalent graphs and data. We're all pretty much most all of the southern mountains are melted out, and there's no more runoff from those. So it's a matter of rainfall, and then we're at the mercy of do we get any rain from storms, fronts that move through. It doesn't look like a lot, and mostly on the east side of the state, they may get some rain in the short term, but over between now and say June, doesn't look like a lot of rain at all, like below average. But I mean, this is the springtime. That's kind of our driest time of year already, except for the east side of the state, whereas they're starting to peak up. They get Gulf moisture wicked up from Texas, so they start to dip into that this time of year.
Okay.
But where we are, the Sacramentos are kind of a dividing line, between the dry and the moist. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, and in terms of this summer in general, in terms of the heat index and everything else, I know it's early to predict that type of thing, especially right now, but what are your predictions for the upcoming summer, and are we going to see another record-breaking year like we did in 2023, or is it looking more moderate? Or can you even say?
Yeah, well, I can base what I know on the forecasts. We call them outlooks. They're in terms of probabilities. And I was just looking at them, and it looks like from now on through the summer, even through the summer, they're predicting high chance of above average. So pretty good probabilities of above average temperatures for our area, even through the monsoon. So be prepared. I think that's kind of my suggestion is be prepared for another hot summer. I'm not going to say it's similar to 23 or 24 where we had 23. We had 109. We had a couple days of 109s in Las Cruces. Remember our all-time high in Las Cruces, and it's at the campus, which has been here since 1892, 110.
Wow.
So I don't want to see that. We don't want to break that temperature, but we'll see.
Yeah, I think you speak for all of us when you say that, because that was a rough time for all of us here in Cruces, I think. But we've been talking a little bit about these climate models, and especially NOAA, some of the stuff you use from NASA, and there's a lot of cuts going on in the federal government as it relates to this type of thing. How much has that affected your work, or has it started to affect your work yet? Is that something that you've been dealing with? Yeah,
well, it's a big topic in a lot of our discussions, especially when we talk with our colleagues, because NOAA, a lot of our funding comes from NOAA, and so and also somewhat NASA. And if you look at the news, as of right now, they're already, they have deadlines of contracts that are supposed to ending, and actually this week is one of them. The regional climate centers, their contract's supposed to end, and
oh boy,
nobody knows. They could renew the contract. They may not. So we basically we have contingency plans. So we rely on our federal partners for our forecast, our outlooks, our predictions, our data, the airport data, and which goes into your smartphone. If you go on that, what's the weather like? It goes to the federal networks. So nobody really knows what's going on in terms of what's going to happen. But we're thinking of contingency. What if this happens? How do we adapt to it? What other data sets? Who's collecting what? How do we make that available? Those are the kind of things that are going on right now, and there's many phone calls going on right now. So,
and well, I guess my follow-up question to that then is, what is the contingency plan should all these cuts start happening?
Yeah, well, I mean, it depends on the area. Water data. There's the USGS has a lot of that. The state has some networks, but there can we have access to some of these federal data sets without having a federal partner give us? I don't know. I mean, those are some big questions, and the models are another thing. I mean, maybe we have to make use of European models or international data sets.
Wow.
I mean, those are available too. We have to pay for those. You know, I don't know.
Yeah, well, it sounds like an area of, sounds like we're all in this area of we're not sure what's going to happen next.
Right.
But, you know, for folks, we don't have a lot of time left, so this will be my last question. For folks that want to stay informed or get involved within citizen science that I know that you're a part of as well, how can they do that?
Yeah, so one of the big programs is nationwide. That's not a federal program. So it is a nonprofit. It's called COCORAS, and it's abbreviation Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. And so it's a citizen science organization providing precipitation measurements. And so we are there to collect data regardless. You know, so it's anybody who can collect it, even if you can just write it on paper and have somebody enter it. So it's a wonderful program because all it takes is an investment of a plastic rain gauge about this big. Go on the website and you can get trained. And it's mostly funded by individuals.
Wow.
And it's yeah. So there are some federal funding as it comes, but even if they go away, it'll still be there because we get funding from people who just, you know, I can get money. You know, I give $20, $100 here. You know, and it helps pay for the servers, the staff, you know, things like that. But that is a wonderful way for anybody to contribute. And it actually, if you get a gauge and set it up in your home, that actually becomes a resource for everybody because it's public, and it becomes an actual weather station.
Right.
You know, and then you can track it and you can collect data, and it's part of our climate record.
Wow. And I imagine if federal funding does start getting cut massively, that COCORAS might be a big nonprofit stepping in, potentially.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Definitely. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, but I do want to thank you, Dr. DuBois, for coming in. It really is valuable to hear from you, and I appreciate you taking the time.
You're welcome.
And that's all for today's episode. Remember, you can stay up to date on the latest local news at krwg.org. For all of us here at KRWG Public Media, I'm Johnny Coker, and we'll see you next time on Fronteras, A Changing America.